welcome, especially those of you who may have had night classes. So I really appreciate everybody coming this morning and getting together to talk a little bit about FERPA. FERPA, as you know, is to education like HIPAA is to healthcare. So it's very important that we all do our due diligence with respect to student privacy and privacy in education. And we are very fortunate to have an adjunct on board that is well networked and engage a fellow Rotarian who's also a local attorney in town. And I'm going to let him introduce him in just a minute. But Carrie Payne, one of our adjuncts who teaches in the healthcare management program, was able to work out with our presenter today to come and speak about FERPA. So we can all learn a little bit more about it and make sure that we're, again, exercising due diligence. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carrie Payne.
Okay, thank you. I would like to introduce Shane Black. He's an old friend, but even more important than that, he's an old friend of my daughter. He was a friend, mentor for her with Han Arundel in Birmingham, Alabama, and again, a friend of my daughter's will always be a friend of mine. He's a great community leader. We were kidding the other day talking about, we have a storyteller at Rotary, and Shane is the president of Rotary. He's very active in the community, as many of you know, but we walked up to Shane, and I also said, you know, Shane is also a great storyteller. And Dr. LaFavor said, oh, you know, she thought I meant as an attorney. But if y'all have a chance this coming Friday, I think you and Billy and are going to be giving storytelling about ghosts of Athens, Alabama. Is that right?
That's right.
He's a graduate of the two greatest universities in the state. I'm a big fan of Alabama. Went to Alabama. He is on the other side of the fence. We love him anyway. So, can I turn it over to you now, Shane?
That'd be fine. Thank you, Carrie.
Thanks.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
All right.
And thank y'all for having me this morning. We're telling ghost stories at Rotary on Friday, and people always ask me about, because we do those little tours in Athens where we do, you know, ghost walks through town, local folklore and history. We can spend all day at the university up here. And I always laugh and tell people, well, I tell the ghost stories all day long, you know, as an attorney, so it's not really much of a change. All right, well, been asked to come talk with y'all about FERPA, okay, which is my favorite acronym to say as far as a lawyer when I'm dealing with laws. Always have acronyms, and FERPA has got to be one of my favorites to say, because you always say, well, Judge, let me tell you about what FERPA says. And invariably the judge looks at you with this look like, what are you talking about? What's FERPA? It doesn't come up in the context of the courtroom very much, but it is a very important law, and it relates to education settings. Whenever there is an institution that receives federal funds from the United States Department of Education programs, it is governed by FERPA. Now, that normally will not apply to private schools of, K-12 private schools, but it always applies to K-12 public education, and it applies to public post-secondary education, such as Athens State. And it applies to most private post-secondary institutions as well, because they are invariably the recipients of some federal funds, whereas private schools, K-12, many times are not. FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. Of course, FERPA is a federal law, which means, in the context of a lawyer, that it trumps any inconsistent or different state laws. So that means that basically you're going to have the same FERPA regulations, the same FERPA rules that apply across the entire nation. What I'm going to try to do is just give y'all an overview of FERPA and hit some of the high points. The statute on FERPA is only about, as far as the law goes, a federal law that receives this much attention, it's about 9 or 10 pages long. But it has created a whole series of cases and administrative regulations which relate to its interpretation. Anytime you've got a federal law, you've got the law itself that Congress passed, and then you've got the Code of Federal Regulations, which presents a series of more detailed instructions relating to FERPA. There are pages and pages and pages of FERPA regulations. There's absolutely no way I'm going to be able to go through all of it. So I will stick with the high points, and then maybe some of y'all may have questions, and if so, I'm happy to take it. Let me start just from the broad idea. The broad idea of FERPA is that students, and in some cases their parents, but once they reach post-secondary, we're talking about the students. Students and their parents have a right to access their educational records, to see those, to review them, and to be able potentially to challenge those. And on the flip side of that, they also have a right that other folks not have access to their educational records. And so when you talk about FERPA, you come from those two broad different purposes. One, I've got access to see my stuff, and the other is everybody else does not have access to come and see my stuff. The FERPA is enforced now through complaints with the U.S. Department of Education, which can be filed and investigated through that federal department. If you are 18 years of age and a student, then these are your rights. If you are not 18, these are your parents' rights. Now, for purposes of Athens State University, once you reach post-secondary, regardless of how old you are, then the student has all of these rights. But if you're thinking of it as I go through, these regulations apply to both K-12 and to post-secondary. But just know that they were the parents' rights, and they transferred over once 18 years of age was hit. Now, the educational records are going to be any type of record that is generated and maintained by the university that applies to this student and this student's performance. It does not mean that it applies to a school calendar or some other generic piece of information that is created that does not have anything to do with that particular student. These would be those students' grades. This would be any health information related to the student that is collected in the context of the educational setting. This could be disciplinary action that was taken against the student. These things are educational records, and they are amongst the things that are protected. The personal observations that a third party may make about another person, notes that aren't a part of the educational record or separate and apart from it, are not necessarily educational records. Okay? What we're talking about are the grades, the grade book, the transcript, the if, like I said, disciplinary proceedings, if that is written up, those things as well. Those are the educational records. If you keep a student notebook, or you keep notes about your students that are your own, that are separate and apart, something you kind of keep as your private work product, your student doesn't have access to those, okay? What we're talking about is the school's official record. Now, let me stop there though and be careful. That does not mean, however, that that information would be subject to access by anyone. To be on the safe side of this law, don't ever start worrying about, well, is this an educational record or is it not an educational record? Can I share it or not share it? Err on the side of not sharing it, because this is private educational information about these students. If you honor the purpose of FERPA, and that is keeping it confidential, you're always, well, 99 times out of 100, you're going to be going in the right place. There are many exceptions, and we'll get into those in a minute, but the general rule is that you do not disclose this type of information, okay? First, access. If a student asks for access to his educational record, the university is bound by federal law to respond and to provide that information within 45 days and give copies of it to the student. That can mean producing it here for the student to review, although if the student commutes from a long ways off, the law also provides that you may have to send the record to the student. Okay, that's access. One point about educational records that I do need to mention: the law. If I'm seeking access, I want to see my grades, I want to see my transcript. I make a request for that. 45 days is that timeline. I've got to get it. It does not require you to create educational records. So, if the student wants some sort of breakdown based on academic predictors and whatnot, and asks the school to create it, that is not what FERPA is about. Again, FERPA is just about the access to the record, not creation. You'd be surprised how many times a student makes a request for some document that just quite simply does not exist. In that event, FERPA does not require anything. I mentioned amendment of educational records. A student has the right to petition the university to change a record if he or she feels that it incorrectly reflects something. This does not mean change a grade, okay? That doesn't mean change some sort of substantive conclusion that has been made. It just means that if the student finds that there is something that is not correctly reported, something that actually occurred that was not correctly reflected or was there was some incorrect information that was contained in an educational record, then the student can make a request to have that changed. And if the university denies that, the student can actually get a hearing where the student can present his or her case. If that then does not turn out the student's way, the student can actually put a written notation into the file under the federal law, which indicates that the student's point of view. But again, the difference there is it's not that the student is asking that, let's say that there's a disciplinary record, and the student feels, well, I was disciplined by the university, I was suspended for a semester because I allegedly broke this university policy. I asked for that to be changed in my record. That's not what FERPA applies to. What FERPA would apply to is if there's an educational record, the student's got a C, but yet the student actually had a B and it was incorrectly put into the document, and the student catches that and petitions for a change. So really it's not as dramatic as it sounds, but the student does have a right to review it and does have a right to ask that it be corrected. That's one of the parts of FERPA. All right, disclosure of educational records. As I said at the beginning, one of the most important features of FERPA, and it is like HIPAA in this way, is that it is meant to make these educational records, for the most part, confidential records. That is to say that the student, it's the law that would prevent me from coming up here, and if Adrian Payne were a student here, going and saying, I want to take a look at Adrian Payne's grades. FERPA would prevent me from doing that. The federal law would say, nope, that's not your business, that's private information, you cannot see it. That would be the same thing that would prevent one of you as faculty members, if there's a student study group and one of them comes up and says, hey, we're all in a study group together, I want to look and see how my buddies did on their test as well, I want to take a look at, that would cover that. Shouldn't be allowed to look at that. That's not their business under the federal law. They cannot look at that information. The only folks that have the right to get to that information are, except for the exceptions I'm about to go over, is the student. Now, unless the student gives written consent, all right? The student can give a written consent. I will allow so-and-so to look at this, in which case, if there is a signed and dated written consent which indicates which records that the other person can look at, and that is provided to the administration, then the third party could be allowed to look at the record. That's just simply saying, yes, it's meant to protect the student, but the student can allow it to go out to some other party. And that may happen in different occasions. Maybe an employer, you can come up with a million different situations in your mind. Maybe we've got a lot of obviously non-traditional students that are coming in here. Some of them are doing it with respect to their jobs. Maybe their employer wants to make sure that the time they're taking off to come over here, they're doing a good job, and maybe they sign a written consent indicating that the employer has access to it, the grades at the end of the semester. That's okay. That'd be fine. Why? Because you've got the written consent that will allow you to do it. Now, most of the time as a practicing attorney representing educational clients, where I run into FERPA is on these exceptions. That is to say, maybe the police need, for whatever reason, to see some portion of the educational records in an institution. Maybe there's an issue with someone, they want to know if that person has ever had any disciplinary problems before, or maybe there is in some cases what you see, not as much in this situation, but in K-12, you'll see parents going through some sort of custody battle or something, and it'll come up in the context of it, or you'll see, you'll often see law enforcement in that situation. You'll see folks that want to do studies. There's all kinds of reasons why folks ask to get involved in these educational records. And the federal law has set out a few exceptions where even though it's not consensual, the law will allow it to be let go, revealed. One of the first and most common sense exceptions is internal within the school. when you've got one school, let's say, that is at the university that is handling this student's educational records, and you got another professor who wants to see them. Idle curiosity will never get you there. You can't do it. Even professors amongst the schools can't just, out of idle curiosity, look at other students' records. But you can if you have what the law calls a legitimate educational interest. And that is to say, of course, in a university community, there may be very legitimate educational reasons related to your instruction at the university. It gives you a reason why you want to check into this person. You're their advisor. Maybe you need to look at a number of different things in their file. You can. The law will allow non-consensual disclosure when it relates to the legitimate educational business of the university. Another is where a student seeks to enroll in a different university. Transfer records, right? If a student is initiating a transfer to another university, that university will request a copy of the transcript. So the law makes provision for that, where that student has initiated it. Financial aid. When a student makes a financial aid application, many times some of that can be contingent on things in the student's record. And so that is another. So there are some very common sense reasons why you might have to do that. Parents, even in the post-secondary context, where the student is a dependent. If the student is a dependent, mom and daddy are going to want to see those records, right? Because mom and daddy are probably helping fund the education. The law will allow, if it is a dependent student, as the IRS defines dependent, then by claiming that person as dependent, the school may non-consensually release the documents. Post-secondary institutions such as Athens State, where there is a health or safety emergency, right? I mean, that makes sense. If there is a health or safety emergency which involves the student, then under this exception, parents can be permitted to gain educational records access related to the health or safety emergency. Also, FERPA will permit a school to disclose information about a student educational records where you have a situation in a post-secondary institution where the student has violated a federal, state, or local law or a rule or policy of the institution governing the use of alcohol or a controlled substance up to the age of 21. So that basically is a situation where you have a younger student who comes in and has gotten in trouble with drugs or alcohol. The university can provide an educational record to disclose some of this personally identifiable information regarding the student. And let me stop right there and just point this out too. As you can see from that exception, when we're talking about educational records, we're not talking just about whether they're making A's and B's. We're talking about, again, any personally identifiable information about the student while they're at the institution. So they've gotten in trouble, because of alcohol or drugs. You might not think, well, that could, but that's an educational record. It's personally identifiable information about that student generated by the university in connection with its educational mission. So it falls under that. Now, another exception is directory information. A lot of universities have student directories, and it sometimes shows the picture, it may show the student, it may show the major, it may have an email address. Do we have those here at Athens State Student Directory? In some places, you do, and I'm sure some of y'all have seen those. Directory information, you think about it, is actually personally identifiable information about that student. However, a university, an institution can do that with respect to certain types of information if there is an annual disclosure that is given out where it lists that type of information and that it will be given out as directory. Athens State may not do it. If any of you have children in K through 12 school, you may have seen this type thing in the student handbook. You get that student handbook every year and then you sign the back page saying you've read it. It's about 50 pages. Buried in there is a FERPA disclosure where it says, okay, we are going to be able to count these items as directory information. And if you don't want your child in this directory, then you need to let us know. One thing that is always in there is honors and awards. Think about it. Giving a student an honor or an award and having that in the educational record is actually protected by FERPA. So you have these disclosure statements where you have school systems that say, hey, that's a part of directory information. You know, if your child wins a scholarship or gets an award, then we can release that as a part of FERPA. And you think about it, well, it's not anything anyone should care about, but it's actually a part of an educational record. And statements that will be listed by FERPA, annual disclosures each year by the institution will sometimes list those things, okay? That's directory information. Other exceptions to FERPA be like if the United States Department of Education is doing some sort of study with respect to students. The federal government allowed itself a big out, an exception in case it wants to do some work relating to tracking performance of students. That's one of them. If the university retains, say, a third party to come in and do a predictive test based on students that requires some grade data be released so that studies can be done, in certain circumstances, that can be disclosed as well. And the one I always run into before as a lawyer is if a judicial order or subpoena requires it. So if you have a lawsuit and you have a court that actually orders that these records be produced, then you've got to produce it. Now you've got to give notice to the student or to the mother and father that these things are being released, but then you can do it that way. To the victim of an alleged perpetrator of a crime of violence or a non-forcible sex offense concerning the final results of a disciplinary hearing with respect to an alleged crime. In other words, victims' rights. Even though you may have be involved in some sort of disciplinary action that involves some sort of a violent contact involving one student or another, there are rights of victims that are given in FERPA, because if you release what happened with that student, you know, what you're doing is you are actually disclosing an educational record. So there's an exception in here to the victim, and then also to any third party if it relates to a crime of violence that violates the rules or policies of the school. Again, makes sense, because if you have a student who has engaged in some act of violence on campus, there's going to be a public interest in what did the student suffer any consequences as a result of this. And at the close of it, if it is determined the student did, then in certain situations, depending on how bad some of those acts are, that can be revealed. But other than these exceptions, now there's a lot of them, but other than these exceptions, the general rule is you cannot disclose. Yes, sir?
What about the Freedom of Information Act? Does that allow people to disclose, to get information?
The Freedom of Information Act does. Now, the Freedom of Information Act does not apply to Athens State University because it's not a federal institution, but Alabama's Open Records Law does apply, and it's very much the same as the Freedom of Information Act. But the FERPA laws will trump all the open records laws. And in fact, on a federal level, the FERPA law trumps the Freedom of Information Act, if Freedom of Information Act applies. One of the exceptions to Alabama's open records law would be documents protected by FERPA. So there you've got an interplay of two different laws. But Athens State University, as a public institution, is governed by the open records law in Alabama, just like the city of Athens is, just like the Athens City Board of Education is. So and let me just say this, the open records law is about one paragraph. It's nowhere near as lengthy and as instructive as FERPA. And so trying to interpret that and apply it is a lot of fun for lawyers, because most of it is judge-made doctrine that you're then trying to apply. But one thing that is very clear is that a federal law that would prevent disclosure is always going to trump a state law that would order disclosure. So in this situation, if there was an open records request by the Athens News Courier or any member of the public seeking an educational record of one of your students, then we would turn that down because it would be violating FERPA, regardless of what the open records said.
What about the perpetrator's information? Is equally protected under law FERPA, or as much as the victims?
Like you going back to these last ones here?
Yeah.
These exceptions are going to relate to the one with the victim relates to the final results of the disciplinary hearing. So it would be opening FERPA up just for the final results of that proceeding, but not as to the student's entire educational record. So let's say that we had a bad incident on campus where you had a student just attack another one in one of your classes, and there was a disciplinary hearing, and that student ended up being expelled from the university, or for a particular period of time or whatnot. And let's say the newspapers got a hold of it and they wanted to run some articles on it. If it was once it went through the disciplinary process at the university, at the conclusion of that, since that would have been a crime of violence, then the final results of the disciplinary hearing could be revealed. But not if the media said, well, was he a good student? What was his grades like? What was his attendance? Nope, that's covered by FERPA. The only the exception allows you to get to is going to be the final results of that disciplinary proceeding that resulted from the from the act of violence. So it can be opened up a little in that respect, but not just all the way up. All the students' records aren't now available. Any other questions? Yes.
So one of the exceptions was if the student is claimed as a dependent parent.
Yes.
How would I know that? I wouldn't know that, right?
Yeah, and that actually raises another great question that many times administration has to deal with, is how do we know some of these things? Some of these exceptions are factual based. FERPA just holds you to a reasonable diligence type standard. We see this sometimes in cases of divorce as well. If we're at a situation where one of these exceptions applies, there's a health emergency or something, you got parents divorced, does that mean both parents have the same access? What does that mean? And oftentimes it can be confusing for individuals. You are charged with just making a reasonable inquiry and then making a judgment call based on the best information that you have at the time. Even though your information may ultimately be incorrect, if you've made a reasonably diligent inquiry such that you are satisfied that you could report to someone, well, I was told this, I asked a few probing questions, I didn't have any other information left, this is what it appeared to me, it appeared reasonable, this is why I did what I did, then you should be fine.
But that would take a student also to what age, 23, 24, in terms of being a covered dependent or IRS regulations. I mean, so it wouldn't be your typical 18-year-old that would still be a dependent. So, it does cause us to ask some questions. Like you talk about, it can be a little, a little difficult to discern sometimes. But
right.
if we do our due diligence and we ask questions, are you still dependent, living at home?
Right. And one difficult thing about that is that the parents, especially right after that, you've got a student who comes in post-secondary to a younger student, let's say, there may be parents that are still very involved in that student's education. And they're going to believe that they have a right to have unfettered access to educational records. And the way to handle that is if you have a student who where that's the situation, you go ahead and you get the written consent from the student on the front end. And it just takes care of all the problems. Yes, I'm totally fine with mom and dad looking at my educational records here throughout my entire tenure and sign it and date it at the bottom, and you've got that documentation. And then you have basically covered yourself with respect to talking to that mother and father. Because, a lot of times, I know you have some non-traditional students, of course, where that's not the case, but you also have many that are younger where, again, parents are still very involved.
We have some that send their parents here to register them or to be advised or on behalf of their child, so, or their 18-year-old or 20-year-old or whatever the case may be. So that's why it gets difficult, and I think this is good for us to talk about, because I think the best course of action, as you're suggesting, is just to get a release on the front end so that we're not questioning that.
Yes, I think so too.
I want to ask a question, Shane, while you're here. You talked about the scope of FERPA, including grades, the grade book, transcripts, disciplinary records. Does it include other items like registration information? Because we have girlfriends, boyfriends, parents, spouses calling, wanting to register, and to us, it's not the student, so we need to be working with the student, but I'd like some advice on that. And then also dates of attendance. We had one recently, it was a third party wanting dates of attendance and confirmation of graduation.
Yes, it will cover all of that. Unless that is a part of the directory annual, remember I mentioned that annual notice, that annual disclosure.
Yeah.
And I haven't had the opportunity to look at the universities. I still looked at that before I came over here this morning to look at the university's annual disclosure to see what exactly it lists. You'll want to take a look at that to see what it lists. Now, sometimes the confirmation that someone has attended and the dates that they have attended frequently are listed amongst directory information. You know, that's the type of information that is not altogether intrusive and could be included in directory information. And so it may be that that is a part of the university's directory statement. As to registration information, those forms that go into admissions and that are approved over there, and that's going to be a part of the educational record. It is, you know, personally identifiable information that is connected to that student, and that student being here.
Question.
Yes.
Back to the parent issue. If the parent demands to attend a meeting that the student is having with the professor, is that an implicit approval that the parent has right to that information? Suppose the parent suddenly becomes the spokesman for that person, for that student. Do we have the right to exclude the parent at that point in time?
Do you have the right to exclude
Yeah, in
the
other
parent?
words, I've had a couple of times where the parent is a pain in the rear negotiating for the student.
I can't believe it.
Well, I mean, are we then to negotiate with the parent or with the student at that point?
Well, you know, if I'm having a meeting with a student and mom or dad show up with the student, set that up. We're not, first of all, we're not at that point, we may or may not be actually reviewing educational records. You know, it's just depending on what we're talking about. I would ask the student always in that situation, you know, you're my student, I mean, you brought your mom, I'm assuming that's fine with you, or am I free to talk about everything, and get that approval, and I'd make a notation of that. Now, as a practical matter, you know, stopping the meeting and asking for a written disclosure may just not be practical and available for you to do. But in that case, we know the student has brought the parent with them, and it is implicit in that, and I would make it explicit by asking that the student is fine with mom or daddy being in there and talking with you in the meeting. But I would make sure, once I have closed that conversation going forward, that if the student was going to have mom or dad involved to that extent, that we get something from the student that indicates that that student is fine with disclosing any of that information to that parent. Because even though that meeting, you may not have had to disclose an educational record at that meeting, but if that student has got that parent that involved, after the next test, it's very possible that you get a call in your office from mama, and she's wanting to know how you did on the test. At that point in time, that is clearly a request for an educational record and disclosure of information from it, and so I'd want to make sure I'd gone ahead and tried to do that on the front end. And I know that kind of puts y'all in an odd situation because you've got so many different kinds of students, but if I'm showing up with my mother, are you probably fine going ahead and having that conversation? Yes, you are. Make sure, talk to the student, make sure the student says that's fine. But then go ahead and make sure that you go beyond that and ask the student, do you want me to continue having these kinds of conversations? And if so, then go ahead and put a system in place then where you can get a consent. That way you don't have to worry about this anymore. Otherwise, you have to worry about it every time you get a request.
But if the parent is doing all of the talking for the student, is that okay?
Yes, if the student enables the parent to do so, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine. And frequently, I would imagine that would be the case that you'd find. But since it's a post-secondary student who is enrolled, at least as it relates to educational records, you need to get the students okay that it's fine to provide that information. Now, if the student's got mom or dad acting as advocate in the meeting, and we're really not talking about educational records, then we're outside of FERPA altogether. But no, there shouldn't be anything wrong with that. Back in the back.
Yeah, Shane, my question has to do a little bit with directory type information. I teach technology classes.
Okay.
And one of the things that we've been trying to do is to get our students involved in social media type things, because that's where a lot of recruiting and things go on. So one of our assignments has been to do with LinkedIn, which is where have you been to school, where have you worked, what's your name, you know, whatever they want to provide. And we give them some basic things, and we even give them a training class here through our career services on how to do it, because it's a very valuable tool.
Right.
Now, what we've been doing is we have in red letters, if you choose not to share this information information, you know, with others, or if we not want for whatever reason to be online, we have an optional assignment. But my question for you is, should we just stay away from that altogether?
No, I think you're fine doing that. I don't think that creates an educational record. I don't think that intersects with FERPA in the sense that LinkedIn is not a, you know, a university produced type thing. You're giving that to them as an option. How much information they provide on there is an option to them, right? No, it's not an option. Oh, I thought.
We have a kind of a grading rubric, and we expect, you know, where'd you go to school for? There's minimum things we'd like to see in our profile.
I still don't think that's, because it's not an educational record. You know, I still don't think that's an educational record maintained and by the university. Does it contain personally identifiable information? Absolutely. But is it an educational record? I don't think it is. So I don't think I don't think that causes a problem.
And they're offered an optional assignment.
Yeah, we do, we do tell them, if you don't want to do this, we understand.
Well, that's, you know, that's just, and that's an extra protection against it. But I mean, I think, even if you didn't do that, I don't think that's an educational record.
Okay.
Yes?
Shane, we have military personnel who are on government payroll and also they get support for financial aids and support. Then their supervisor requests, you know, I want this person's record.
Mm-hmm.
We still have to go through the authorization from the students here.
Yes, but I think one of the exceptions may apply there. I'll have to go back and look at that specific situation. I know there are some specific issues related to military personnel, and that may be one. To answer your question, I'll have to go back and look at the Code of Federal Regulations, because I do think one of those exceptions has application there. Now, you guys can see, that's why I say that on the whole, err on the side of your first thought is it's an educational record, I cannot produce this. But then it's at the point where then you see, okay, does an exception apply? And that's where I think you run it up the flagpole and you may need more assistance in trying to determine whether or not one of these exceptions applies. But your first, you know, for further study. But your first indication should always be caution on this aspect. Yes, ma'am.
From a practical standpoint, as a faculty person,
Mm-hmm.
I still, to this day, have students try to have email conversations with me about their class performance through personal emails. Now, am I wrong in thinking that I have no idea who's actually on the other end of that email, if it's a personal email? But if it's a school email, I should be able to have that back and forth.
Really, as that question gets to FERPA, your question is, am I really talking to the person who has the right to seek this information? I think it kind of goes back to what your question was, or our conversation. I think you have a burden on you to do a reasonably diligent inquiry to make sure that you're comfortable, that you're talking with the person who has the right to get that information. You are not going to be held strictly liable in a situation where you've been defrauded, you know, you've been tricked or duped. But you do have, you know, a reasonable duty. Now, one way to, you know, deal with that is to ask if they all use those emails. And I think that that's certainly the safest course of action. Does that mean that, you know, we need, those of you who may have interacted with the student at one point on their personal emails need to worry? Well, whether, now the university may not want you to communicate with them like, as a matter of policy, and I understand it, but as a matter of FERPA, now if you felt comfortable and confident that you were talking with that student and you had access from that student to an email address and you knew it was connected to them, has that gotten you in trouble in FERPA? Probably not. But the safe bet is your practice. I mean, that's the safest bet, because you know that's a university created email that belongs to that student.
Yeah, and if they have allowed someone else to use it, they violated the policy. So it's a reasonable assumption if it's a school email that it's the school.
I think that's a reasonable assumption that you can make, you know, especially when it's got the name down there at the bottom of it. I mean, you can't be Sherlock Holmes and look behind everything before you respond. You know, you've just got to have a reasonably diligent inquiry. Well, y'all, this is just the high points of FERPA. There's pages and pages and regulation after regulation. I'm sure y'all would much rather heard me get up here and talk to you about ghost stories, right? But this is, yeah, that'd have been more fun at 8 o'clock in the morning too. But no, but that's an overview, 10,000-foot view of FERPA. Again, I want to close it by just reminding y'all that the most important things on both sides. Number one, access. They have access. Students have access to their educational records to see them and to review. And there's enforcement mechanisms in case they were denied. And then number two, confidential nature of the educational records. That not only do they have access to them, but in most cases, except for all those exceptions that I mentioned, in most cases, other folks cannot get to them. Yes, sir?
Can the school charge for that information that they request?
You know what? I've never had that question before, but I do not think that the school can charge for the review of their record. In fact, I'm pretty sure no. The answer to that is no. The question might be, could the school charge for copies of any records that they make? Now that is a different question. I've just never had it before. I have
charge the transcripts, so.
Well, you do, but what you're doing is you're making a copy of doing that. Could I just come in and look at my transcript and have access to it? Yes, I could. I'm not I'd have to look and see about the charge there, but when you see charges normally associated with this and with open records and other, it's because it's, okay, we have to go make copies of this and there's time for you in certifying it and putting that together, and so we can make a reasonable charge to you based off that. But if I just wanted to access it and just go over there and just review it, could I do that without a charge? I don't think you can charge. You couldn't put any, let me put it like this, and I'd have to look into it deeper to see if you can make any charge at all. And y'all may know, do they charge just for review of records?
Students have access to their transcripts electronically and their grades, so at any time they can go into the
just unfettered review.
But those are unofficial.
You could not put any.
Yeah.
You can't put any obstacle. Let me put it this way. I'd have to find out whether or not there's somebody that's charged some nominal fee for inspection. Maybe there is, but I'll say this. You cannot put an obstacle to a student accessing their educational records. So you couldn't say, well, sure, you can look at it, it'll be $50. No, you can't do that. Federal law says I get to review it. Now, could there be a nominal $1 to $2 charge or something? Maybe there could be. I've never had that question before. I'd have to take a look closer. But now copies, if a student comes in there and they get their access and now they want copies of everything, and you're running off copy after copy, it's generally accepted in whether it's freedom of information, open records, or something like FERPA, that you can charge reasonable cost for the copies. And that's where you're going to see the transcript charge. Yes, ma'am.
It has always been kind of standard that if a student owes a bill to the school, that they can't request official transcripts be sent. Is that still the same, and can the school still do that?
You mean if they can't get the transcripts if they owe money to the school? I'd have to check on it. I haven't had that one either.
It's always
They
been
can.
that way.
If they have a financial obligation for the institution,
They can.
There's a whole other way.
But
Don't
that
they
doesn't
have
mean
the
they
right
can't
to
see
get
them,
it,
right?
they can see the records.
Right.
They can still see them.
Send.
They just can't get copies of them.
I see.
Official.
Right.
There is an unofficial transcript they can have,
Yes.
but
One more question, then we need to wrap up.
If we have a student that's having trouble graduating or whatever, and we want to resolve that, we'll undoubtedly talk to 3 or 4 other people, other professors. Is that okay?
Yes. Yes, discussions amongst professors would be, y'all have legitimate educational business with one another. You're talking about a student, we need to get the student to graduate, how can we help this student along? So you're going to share information because you're acting within the university community, you're acting within professors, talking with one another, sharing information for that purpose. That's fine. That's the very first exception to disclosure. The only situation I can think of, quite frankly, for one of y'all that would really keep you from doing it is you were just doing it out of idle curiosity, and you really weren't involved with the student in any way. That was maybe not your school, it wasn't a graduation issue, you just wanted to see how that student was doing. That would not be a good enough reason to look. Well, your question on military and this question about the debt owed, those are the two that I was just not familiar with. I'm going to check on those.
Okay, sounds good.
I'll get back to you on those.
Sounds good.
Thanks, guys, for having me. It's great to see you.